to the second Paul Streeten lecture. I'm Dilip Mukherjee from the Institute for Economic Development, and I'm a professor in the economics department. This event is sponsored by my institute, the Department of Economics, and the Pardee Global Development Center, headed by Kevin Gallagher, who's also here, and he will be moderating the Q&A session after the lecture. It's great to see such a fantastic attendance. This lecture was supposed to have been held exactly a year ago, but we, of course, know the unfortunate turn of events that prevented us from doing that, and we're very glad that we are able to again feature Anne Harrison, who's agreed to speak remotely today. Let me back up and say a few words about Paul Streeten, whose legacy we celebrate in this lecture. As you all probably know, he was a professor at this university between the mid-70s and the mid-80s. He was an eminent economist and interdisciplinary scholar with very significant impact on trade, industrial development, economics, and policy. He had many distinguished contributions to leading journals, economics journals on the theory of industry and trade. He had a distinguished career in the UK Department of Overseas Development, as it was called at that point. He founded the leading interdisciplinary journal in development called World Development. And he was one of the intellectual forces behind the widening of the development policy agenda worldwide, focused on human development. He provided critical inputs to the United Nations Development Program, was instrumental in the creation of the Human Development Goals, the Human Development Index, also a very influential advisor to the World Cultural Report of the UNESCO. So he represented a remarkable career combining both academic research and contribution to development policy. I remember meeting him for the first time in a conference in Manila, the Asian Development Bank, in the early 90s. And his talk, in contrast to everybody else at that conference, was on a topic I had never heard of before called governance. And for me, it was a mystical talk. But it's remarkable how far ahead of the wave he was, how prescient he was. So at that time, he was concerned about governance and sustainability. He actually visited BU in the late, I think about 10, 12 years ago, and delivered a set of lectures called Technological Nightmares about post-industrial society. We are very fortunate that members of his family are able to attend this lecture. Now let me turn to introducing our speaker. We are very privileged that Anne Harrison agreed to deliver the second Streeten lecture. There are very few people in the world I can think of who can match Paul Streeten's span of academic interest and accomplishments in development policy. As most of you know, Anne has combined being a high priestess in the corridors of academia. She publishes regularly in leading journals like the American Economic Review, the Review of Economics and Statistics, World Development, Journal of Development Economics, on trade and industrial policy, particularly in China and India. She also has a distinguished experience in development policy. She worked for the World Bank about 10, 12 years ago. She was the director of development policy there, with critical inputs into the World Development Report and some remarkable data transparency projects of the World Bank. After the World Bank, she moved to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania as a professor of business policy. And last year, or 2019, she moved to the Haas School of Business as the dean at the University of California, Berkeley. So she combines her academic research with books on contemporary topics such as globalization and poverty, offshoring, environmental laws, and the evolution of post-industrial society. And in 2017, she was awarded the Sun Yefang Prize by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which is considered one of the most important honors in economics in China. The topic of our lecture today, the role of industrial policy in development, is obviously of great contemporary relevance, not only in China and India and other developing countries, but also in the US, as the new Biden administration is grappling with how to restore manufacturing, infrastructure, technology, and energy in the United States. So again, I'm really looking forward to the lecture. She will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes. During her lecture, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A that you should see. There's a Q&A tab on the bottom right of your screen. And before you enter your question, please add your name and your affiliation. After the lecture, Kevin Gallagher will be moderating the Q&A, and he will select questions from those fielded in the Q&A, and he will pose them to Anne so that she can answer them in groups of a few questions at a time. And the plan is to go for approximately an hour from now. Okay, over to you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Dilip. Thank you so much for this wonderful honor. I'm really just delighted and looking forward to it. I'm now going to have to figure out how to share my screen. Let's see, does that work? Slideshow. And I think we're all set. Are we all set? Can everyone hear me? Great. So again, thank you very much for this honor. I'm really just so flattered. And I did want to say that how much I admire Paul Streeten, who is someone who combined both a distinguished career in academics, wrote many books and articles, founded the very important journal World Development, which I've published a lot in, and was also a doer. He was involved during World War II in trying to work with refugees in refugee camps, and he's done some amazing work. I'm particularly grateful to him for a book he wrote with Sanjay Lal, another one of the people that I really admired, on multinationals in the role of economic development. And some of his work really echoes a lot of the work that I took up later, where he talked about it's possible that multinational firms with their enormous market power may not have been doing exactly what emerging markets thought they were doing when they brought their capital to those countries. And he talks about their oligopolistic power. So very impressive. I'm also really thrilled that some of my some people from Haas are here to listen. So thank you for joining us. I'm really excited that my colleagues from Haas are also able to be here today. So let me start. I want to start with the motivation for this focus. And I think the best way to start is by just showing some images of some countries and what they've managed to do in the last 70 years. So this picture here is Schengen Avenue, one of the most important avenues in Beijing in the 1950s. If you look at it, you'll see everyone in the 50s is riding bicycles, just very peaceful. If you then look at it today, here's the picture today, what you see is just a tremendous growth story. Just those two images are just phenomenal. China is an incredible success story. We can do this with other countries as well. So for example, Here's Seoul in the 1950s. This is the Cheonghae River, which runs through Seoul. These are what it looked like in the 1950s. My husband's from the Philippines. Unfortunately, parts of Manila continue to look much like the pictures you see here. What's really incredible to see is 60 years later, that same river looks like. For a while, the river was covered over, and then the mayor realized it was a tremendous opportunity. It was uncovered. It was created into an amazing space that many people go to. If you look in the end of the picture, you see people swimming, and it's just a tremendous transformation. So when I see transformations like this, I'm just really intrigued by why and how did that happen in some countries and not in others. In particular, I'm really fascinated by what the role is for the government, and in particular, what the role is for industrial policy in creating this kind of transformation. So if you look at the kinds of emerging markets that have managed to move from emerging markets to middle income or even high income countries, there's actually very few in the last 50 or 60 years. So let's just get a sense of what those countries are like. I'm going to use as a basis a working paper by somebody who's not known for favoring industrial policy, so you won't think I'm being biased in my choice. This is a working paper by Robert Barrow, known for being against government intervention in general. And in 2016, he published a nice paper summarizing which countries have been able to move from lower to middle income successes. And hopefully, can you all see the screen? Is it clear? Yes. So if you look at the countries, what at least struck me when I read this paper is how many of those countries are actually countries, a lot of them in East Asia, and many of them, most of them countries which were marked by pronounced government intervention and extensive use of industrial policy. Same thing if you instead using convergence as a measure of success, if instead you look at sustained growth, you come up with a very similar group of countries. The World Bank is known for having contributed to something called the Growth Commission report, which Joe Stiglitz, who gave this talk 2 years ago, was part of. I think he co-led. In the Growth Commission report, they identified only 13 countries that had had significant sustained growth over 25 years. And by that, they meant growth of 7% or over 25 years. A lot of the same countries as appear on this list. 9 of the 13 countries they identified were in Asia, and they had all used industrial policy extensively. Now, many of you at this point are probably looking at me askance and saying, well, didn't you learn your lessons in graduate school? Don't you know that correlation does not imply causation? And that's absolutely correct. So one thing you might say in reply is, well, but what's the counterfactual here? Is it possible that a country like China would have done even better if it had not used industrial policy? And this is the part where my screen, what if it had not used industrial policy? So the question here is, did success cases succeed because of industrial policy, or in fact, would all these countries that I mentioned been doing even better without the use of industrial policy? What's the counterfactual? And one thing that is often mentioned by critics of the use of industrial policy is the fact that the benchmark Shanghai Composite Index, a standard measure of the stock market in China, has not recovered since its peak in 2007. So I want to just, this is by way of motivation. So it's a really fascinating question, not an easy one to answer because of this issue of identifying what's cause and effect. But I want to sort of briefly take you through my thinking about this over the last probably 20 years. I'll start very briefly with an example from the past. I'll go to the present, and then I'll talk about issues which are in the present and the future, in particular, green industrial policy, the race for a COVID vaccine, and then I'll give some general conclusions. When I talk about the present, I'll talk about some successful examples of industrial policy, and I'll use the example of China. And then I'll talk about failed uses of industrial policy, and then I'll use one example from India. So let me see if I can get through all this. It's a very ambitious agenda. I may have to cut some of it short. So let me start. For some reason, I'm having trouble moving this forward. Let me start with the question of what do we mean by industrial policy? And I refer you to a handbook chapter that I wrote with Andres Rodriguez-Clare in 2010 that appeared in the Handbook of Industrial Development Economics, edited by Danny Roderick. Andres is a wonderful individual at Berkeley today who was a minister in the Costa Rican government. So our working definition of industrial policy is any intervention which shifts incentives away from policy neutrality, beyond those associated with optimal taxes or some sort of introduction of a distortion, possibly a price distortion. It is a broad conception of industrial policy, and I'll refer to IP when I talk about industrial policy. And it spans a range of policies, and I'm going to be very generic in talking about these. I'm going to talk about hard industrial policies, and by that I'll mean policies that affect prices, so a tariff, a subsidy, a tax break for a new business or for foreign investors. And then I'll also talk about what I think of as soft industrial policy as well. And by that, I could mean trade promotion, or I could mean infrastructure investment. The Biden administration is talking a lot about a Green New Deal. So that would be an example of green industrial policy, but it's a soft industrial policy, or helping businesses overcome coordination failures. Now, what's the rationale in economics for hard industrial policy? In order to be able to justify intervening in the market and shifting prices across sectors, it would have to rely on some sort of market failure. The most important for a rationalization for industrial policy are listed on the right. So agglomeration or Marshallian economies, some sort of economies of scale, so that the more you do it, the cheaper it gets, for example. What I will show you an example of latent comparative advantage driven by Marshallian economies, a lack of competition, so a naturally oligopolistic market is a market failure, which could also justify industrial policy by promoting entry. And of course, the classic case of market failure, which is some sort of negative environmental externality, pollution, for example. Now, when we talk about the theoretical rationale for industrial policy, one of the pushbacks we often get, and this is something that Robert Barrow, for example, would probably tell us if he were at this talk, the pushback we often get is maybe the cure is worse than the disease. So is government failure actually worse? So you tell me we have these market failures, we need to intervene, but what if in fact the institutions are weak and cannot actually resist lobbying for the wrong interventions? There's rent seeking, for example. Or what if the government is the best intentioned, is very honest, but simply can't pick the right sectors because identifying sectors with a quote unquote latent comparative advantage is very difficult. So really a lot of the times when people fall in the camps of being for or against industrial policy, it's not because they don't recognize the theoretical justification, which is often there, because it's not exactly true that markets are often perfectly functioning. But usually what happens when people oppose industrial policies because they typically believe that the government failure is worse than the market failure. The only way really to get at that is to look at the evidence. But before we do that, I want to give you a visual representation of latent comparative advantage so that those of you who love graphs can get a better idea of what it's coming from. So this is really what this is the market for watches, the global market for watches. And we have a downward sloping demand curve, D. Unlike most textbook examples, the supply curve, instead of being upward sloping, is in fact downward sloping. Now, why is it downward sloping? Because there's some type of Marshalling externalities, and the more you produce watches, the lower your average cost. So it's a downward sloping supply curve. Notice that the equilibrium is where the intersection of the Swiss supply curve and the global demand curve, that intersection is at 0.1. The equilibrium price is P1 and the equilibrium quantity is Q1. So in the world, the Swiss are producing the watches and the Thai economy is not part of the story. Now, why is that? Because if you look at the Thai supply curve, they're actually able to produce at a cheaper price. They have what we call a latent comparative advantage. They're not producing because if they were to start producing very small quantities, they would be up at C0, which is above the going international price. So they can't get into the market because they don't have the scale, and therefore they're not basically competitive in terms of cost. If, however, their government were to give them a little push, then they could actually undercut the Swiss. So that would be an argument for why industrial policy could be beneficial by shifting the market towards the Thai, away from the Swiss, and allowing them to realize their latent comparative advantage. Now, notice that in this case, since scale is likely important, then if you're a big country or if you have a big internal market, you will be at an advantage, right? So this is a simple way of illustrating all the power of the potential power of government intervention. But what if the government got it all wrong, and instead of promoting the watch industry, they promoted, I don't know, the organic food industry in Thailand, and that was not a sector where Thailand had a latent comparative advantage? Then in some sense, it's a misuse of government resources. Or what if government resources were allocated according to who was best friends with the government? So you can see both the theoretical power of this argument as well as the practical challenges in implementing it. So the way I think of it, I'm an empiricist at heart, although I do believe in the power of theory, hence the partnership with Andres Rodriguez-Clare. For me, the best thing to do is look at the evidence and see how this has played out over the centuries. So I'm going to start with the past very briefly, just because I think it's fascinating that countries have been using industrial policy ever since the Industrial Revolution. We can in fact start with Louis XIV. So Louis XIV saw that England was industrializing, and Louis XIV wanted France to catch up. And so this is Vincent Cronin writing a wonderful book about Louis XIV's industrial policy. Here's what he writes. France must manufacture everything she had imported. She must become an industrial country, not in 2 or 3 generations, but now, at once, virtually overnight. For Louis XIV was impatient for greatness. You probably know he was known as the Sun King, very famous French monarch. So what did Louis XIV and his ministers do to get France to catch up? Well, they did something that we are still doing today, and this was in the 1660s. They started bringing in talented immigrants who knew the new information, who had the new technology, by subsidizing them, by offering them attractive wages. Cloth makers, metal workers, weavers, steel workers from England, sugar refiners from Holland and Germany. They used import tariffs, something we're still doing today. They doubled the import tariffs in 1667. So those would be considered hard industrial policies, but they also engaged in all these facilitating measures, which I think of as soft industrial policy, like promoting scientific knowledge through the establishment of the world's first scientific journal, infrastructure investment, reduction of customs barriers between provinces to promote competition. Now, notice the reduction of customs barriers expands the market, allowing you to exploit Marshallian economies, and also promotes competition, which is a really important theme of today's talk, and that I'll come to again and again. So the next example I want to give you is Napoleonic Wars. I said at the very beginning of this talk that one of the biggest challenges is figuring out what's cause and what's effect, what the counterfactual might look like. The Napoleonic Wars, it could be a way to allow us to get around the causality. France imposed a blockade on Britain that was the leader of mechanized cotton spinning looms. So it's a quasi-natural experiment whereby the price of imported yarn and consequently the gains from adopting new technology, and new technology here is defined as the adoption of mechanized spinning looms. Essentially what's going to happen is the cost now of importing yarn from Britain is going to vary geographically throughout France. And that's going to allow us to see what happens when domestic resource costs go. So did that protection lead to more technology adoption in high yarn importing regions? And did that benefit last? Rekha Juhas, who's an assistant professor at Columbia University, wrote a paper. You can find that paper in the 2018 AER. And you can actually visually see what the effects of the blockade under Napoleon was on the number of ships traveling between France and Britain. The large blue circles indicate how many ships went from Britain to France. You can see that before the blockade, there were lots of ships from Britain going to northern France. They were also going to other parts of Europe. Post-blockade, what's important to note is that there aren't a lot of ships going to France anymore. They're going to Spain, they're going to Northern Europe, they're going to Malta. So what that means is for yarn to get from Britain to Northern France, it's first going to have to go to Spain or Northern Europe, and then it's going to have to be carried across land all the way to France. So the cost of imported yarn is going to go up way more in the north of France, where it was really cheap before because it was right across the channel. It's going to go way more there than in the rest of France. So there's this natural experiment, a shock that changes the price of imported yarn indifferentially, leading to differential incentives to invest in technology adoption, which remember we define as adopting the new spinning technology. So as I said before, the trade costs are going to increase more in the north. So the darkest blue indicates bigger costs of trade. So it's the equivalent of an increase in tariff that's bigger in the north than in the south of France. Then the question is, what happened to technology adoption? So what this shows you here is how many spindle technologies were adopted. And as you can see, after the blockade, moving from the left to the right, a lot more technology adoption in the north of France, where the effects of the blockade were biggest relative to the rest of France. So this is akin to import tariffs being raised more in the north than in the rest of France, leading to an increase in productivity. it's basically a test of the infant industry argument. And what's really interesting is that that effect persists over 100 years. This is look in the right graph, 100 years later, the effects of that blockade, which temporarily made it expensive to import yarn from Britain, are lasting. And there are more spindles per 1,000 inhabitants in northern France, in Brittany and Normandy, than there are in the rest of France. That's an example of a successful but accidental industrial policy. Let me move to the present. I was going to talk a little bit about the IDB's study on industrial policy, which they call Rethinking Productive Development. But because I seem to be moving more slowly in this talk than I thought I would, I'm actually going to skip the IDB. And I'm going to go straight to my own work on China and India's experiences with hard industrial policies. So remember, hard industrial policies are those that distort prices, either through tariffs or quotas or other forms of intervention. And I'm going to start with China. I'm going to present an example of successful intervention. Actually, it was actually featured in the New York Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago in an article entitled Visible Policies. And then I'm going to talk about an example where India was not successful. So let me start with the successful case. This is very much of a co-authored paper with two former PhD students, Jing Kai and Luo Shadu, and several theorists who provided the some of them very famous, like Philippe Aguillon, who provided the theoretical justification for the empirical work. The theme of this paper, and again, this is really important for when industrial policy works, is that it's going to work when it promotes competition. Now, the real sort of contribution of this paper is people think of industrial policy as necessarily being protective, as discouraging competition. What we're saying is, in fact, it should be the opposite. You should engage in industrial policies that promote entry, that promote more competition. And that's going to actually complement rather than destroy competition. So competition is great. It'll weed out mistakes if you chose the wrong sectors. It's also going to be good for firms that would otherwise differentiate and move into market segmented sectors and not compete directly with each other. We can show that a really clever industrial policy will force them to compete head to head. And what we're going to show is that the more of this there is, the more innovation there will be. So competition induces innovation, and therefore industrial policy that induces competition is good for innovation. So in this particular case, industrial policy is an instrument for combating a very specific kind of market failure. Remember, to justify industrial policy, you need some form of market failure. The market failure in this framework is not enough competition. So just a quick question, Dilip and Kevin, when should I try to terminate this talk? It's 4:35 now.
Well, I think you were slated to go until 4:45, but you could go up to 4:50. So which would be 1:50 your time.
15 minutes left.
15 minutes, yeah.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about how we measure industrial policy and how we measure a more competitive industrial policy. So we're going to use what a Herfindahl, a policy Herfindahl. Now, remember what a Herfindahl is. It'll take the market share and square it and sum it up in a sector. Here, we're taking the market share of the subsidy you receive or the market share of the loan you receive. So you see this Herfindahl subsidy there? The subsidy as a share of all the subsidies in sector J okay, in region R, time T for firm I will be squared. Now, what I am going to do is I'm going to actually sum that up across all the firms in your sector and region to get a Herfindahl for you, but I'm going to exclude your own subsidy because that would make this an endogenous measure, which we don't want to do. We want to be able to argue there's causality here. So let's imagine that all of the subsidies went to one firm. Then that firm would have 100% market share and that Herfindahl would be 1. If all the subsidies were really diffuse, spread out, and everybody got a fraction, then that Herfindahl would go to 0. And to make a good number, so notice a good number here is 0 and a bad number where you're targeting only one firm is 1. We want to switch it. So we're going to make it 1 minus the Herfindahl is going to be our measure. So if the Herfindahl is very diffuse, which creates more competition, the Herfindahl is 0, 1 minus 0 is 1. So a bigger number means we've allocated this to more firms. And we're going to have different kinds of industrial policies that we're going to test for the effects of. We're going to do the same Herfindahl for loans. We're going to do the same Herfindahl for tax holidays. And we're going to see whether a more competitive allocation, a more egalitarian allocation promotes a firm's growth. So I'm only going to show you one table. The dependent variable here is total factor productivity measured using Ollie Pecos. It's at the firm level. And what you see is that this Herfindahl is positive and significant and positively affects your productivity. And remember, it's a sector-wide region-specific measure, so it excludes your own subsidy. And that makes it, that reduces the endogeneity of the argument. Now, I'm not going to talk about some extensions, but here what really is interesting. If you rewrite this Herfindahl to weight younger firms more, to give more weight to market entrants, the effect is tripled. So in order to maximize the positive effects of industrial policy, first of all, you want to spread it out. You don't want to just give it to 1 or 2 players. Secondly, you want to promote entry. Again, this theme of competition. So targeting younger firms yields more gains, right? So really important message to think about in when we think about how to design an effective industrial policy. So the takeaways here are you want industrial policy to be implemented in a way that's either competitive or in a way that promotes competition. Firm level innovation will be higher if you do that. I didn't talk at all, however, about another instrument used by China, tariffs. China has used tariffs extensively. Turns out, and this is in some of the papers also that I published in World Development that Paul Streeten founded that journal, turns out that tariff protection is always associated with lower productivity growth, even when targeted at competitive sectors. So one of the takeaways is that not all industrial policies are alike. And in particular, tariffs, which inherently discourage competition, are not effective instruments of industrial policy in the Chinese case. So that's kind of an interesting result, which I found in various specifications and papers when I've looked at it. And as I said before, the positive effects of subsidies are much higher when allocated to younger. Now I want to switch and show you a case where industrial policy doesn't work. This is a recent paper that appeared in the AER, again with 2 former PhD students, Shanti Nataraj, who has just joined Amazon as a research head, and Leslie Martin at the University of Melbourne. It's important to understand that the question should be framed as not whether or not industrial policy is good or bad. It can always be good. It's about how it's implemented. And so that's why I'm showing you a case of positive effects and to show you a case where it was not well done. It's all about the how. So in this case, we're going to examine an industrial policy that promoted small and medium enterprises. It was called the Small Scale Reservations Policy. And it was used to really encourage small is beautiful. But beginning in 1998, India eliminated this policy. And so we're going to look at the impact of phasing out the small scale reservation policy in India. So here we're looking at getting rid of an industrial policy. And the question is, if it was not well designed, then that should lead to positive effects. But if in fact it was doing good, then it should lead to negative effects. Now, the great thing about looking at this is that, again, it's a kind of a quasi, but not exactly natural experiment, because as you can see here, India reserved up to 1,000 products for small firms by the heyday of the small scale reservation policy, but starting in a certain period, got rid of every single one. So the advantage of that from a researcher's perspective is that there's no selection bias. Got rid of all of it. And we're going to look at what happened when they got rid of small scale reservation policy. And because we're kind of running out of time, I'm going to skip some slides. And there were two kinds of firms that were affected by this. There were incumbents who were suddenly faced with more competition, and there were entrants who were never able to play in this space before. As you can see, incumbents lost output, they lost labor, they lost capital, although it had no effect on their wages, but entrants gained tremendously. Employment went up, output went up, investment went up, wages went up, and productivity went up. If you then combine the two effects to see what the net impact on Indian employment and output and capital investment and wages were, the net effects are overwhelmingly negative, with significant increases in employment, output, wages, and productivity. So this is a case of a policy that wasn't a good idea, and where removing the policy led to very positive. Explain this graph, but generally what we find is that younger and larger firms generate more employment growth. And that's why this small scale reservation policy wasn't a good idea, because it penalized young entrants and large firms. So the future, really going to have to rush here. I think the biggest market failure in history of humanity. And so one of the most exciting new areas is green industrial policy. Very exciting market failure to identify. Usually the first best instrument is not used. In current conversations, the Biden administration is talking too much about trying to address two targets: reducing climate change and increasing employment, with one goal, with one instrument, which is not a good idea. We have a paper where we summarize what we know about what is the right kind of green industrial policy. A lot of the lessons I've already talked about are repeated here. You want to link the instrument to the problem. You want to encourage competition and new entrants. You want to make the support temporary. And again, you really need to tailor the solution to the strength of local. Do you have institutions that are capable of withstanding rent seeking and lobbying? That's extremely important. Can they pick the right sectors? So I'm going to skip this work that I did on India. Just going to mention this and then I'm going to conclude. I think the race for a vaccine is a great example of the use of successful industrial. So here's a quote from an article that came out 2 weeks ago in the New York Times Magazine. The government didn't just write checks to Pfizer. It told 7 companies, go develop a vaccine. It's a competition. You get everybody vying to succeed, and that really makes a difference and creates a successful form of industrial. Okay, so let me just conclude. Industrial policy is back. You want it to be combined with competition for it to be successful, just like we saw in the design of the program to encourage the development of vaccine. The key here is weighing government failure against market failure. If you happen to be in a country that is run by an individual, this happens to be Imelda Marcos with all her shoes, that is not a good situation in which to engage in large-scale industrial. But relying on the invisible hand is not the answer either. So just to conclude, this is my last slide. History is full of cases showing us both successful and uses of industrial policy from Louis XIV down to our present day. Countries are using it more than ever today. And we've identified some critical components to make it successful. What is the market failure we're talking about? Is it climate change? Is it Marshalling externalities? It's important to understand it. You need to pick the right instrument to address that failure. You need strong institutions, competition either internally at the national level or globally by promoting export competition will correct many wrongs. And finally, don't be afraid to change course if events prove you wrong. Sorry I went over, but I'm done.
Thanks so much, Dean Harrison. Can you take your screen down and we'll take some questions. My name's Kevin Gallagher. It's an honor to have you here with us, Dean Harrison. I direct the Global Development Policy Center, the GDP Center, and we're glad to be co-sponsoring with Institute for Economic Development and the Department of Economics here. For those of you in the audience, if you go to the chat function, you can see information about the Institute for Economic Development, the Department of Economics, GDP Center, and some of the work that Professor Harrison has done over her career in the links. But you can go ahead and put some questions in the Q&A part. I know Dilip started by saying how he regrets that you couldn't be here in person, but if you were here in person, we'd be in trouble because the fire marshal probably would have made about half of the people leave. You've attracted well over 200 people. So those are one of the small benefits of being able to do this remotely. Well, when you have 200 people, you have a lot of great questions, and we've only got a little over 10 minutes to answer them. So for those of you who ask questions, I might not be able to get to all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but I want you to know, Anne, that this has really sparked off quite a conversation. I want to start, as we always do, with a BU student, if I may. And I have a question here from Christopher Kahan, who is a senior in the economics department at Boston University. He's an undergrad, and it looks like he's got a job going to work for Goldman in Salt Lake City after this. So cheers to you, Christopher. He has begun research and really become struck by the global concerns about climate change. And he asks, how, given China's big pledge to come to net zero emissions by 2060, to what extent will industrial policy need to be a component of that? And do you think that countries unlike China, who can't afford or have the means for the financing of the infrastructure and the subsidies that you talk about throughout your papers, to what extent will they be able to have green industrial policies in, say, Africa? There's another country, a comment by Yan Wang, who used to work with you at the World Bank and who's now here at BU. She also asked a similar question: to what extent could industrial policy travel to Africa, perhaps? Another person had a similar question about the extent to which institutions matter in China's political system, or the East Asian political systems have a big role in this. That's sort of one cluster of questions about to what extent can China do industrial policy for green, given there's been so much investment, perhaps path dependent, in a brown industrialization? And secondly, can it travel? A similar question, or another question, comes from Nicholas Maestra. And Nicholas is from UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, probably the one global agency that's always been for industrial policy when it was in favor and out of favor. He's got a specific question about one of your graphs. It says your Herfindahl index focuses on the distribution of the subsidies across firms, yet it doesn't capture how big the subsidies are. This does not capture the notion that sometimes you need a minimum push, which is big enough to allow for structural transformation. How could you control for that? Could you comment? And I'll ask one more.
I won't remember the questions if you don't stop now.
Okay. In case we run out of time, let me just ask you one that I know the other BU students want to ask, but they're always too shy to. And that's, if you could have your closer sort of be, what's your advice to the young economist, to the young social scientist who wants to go into academia, but wants to grapple with some of these big questions, but doesn't see much space for it, and wants to build a career that's both academically rigorous, but policy relevant? And for young people in general, but women in particular, in your field, in your branch of economics, there's, especially in your generation, not a heck of a lot of women out there. What's your advice to young people in general and young women in particular in the field?
Wow, that's a lot of questions. Well, let me just start with the first one, which is, can you afford to engage in green industrial policy? One paper that I didn't get to present is a working paper where I look with the same co-authors, Leslie and Shanti, at India's experiences with trying to deal with very big challenges. And you can basically use variation in coal prices to identify what the effects of a coal tax would be, and they're really enormous. So a coal tax really leads to enormous reductions in the use of dirty fuel, and is even more powerful than the use of these command and control policies that India has used in a lot of cities called the Supreme Court action plans. A tax, any country can impose a tax because a tax is revenue generating. And since it's targeting a negative externality, presumably it's not distorting. So anybody can afford to impose a carbon tax. Obviously there are political issues involved, but I mean, it's not a surprise that one of the first policies countries use to generate revenue is import tariffs, right? Because anybody can impose import tariffs. So I would say that we can all afford that. And China, of course, has invested massively in greening the economy, primarily through enormous investments. But other countries can do so too. And I think there's massive scope. I mean, Indonesia, one of my board members basically created the solar farm industry in Indonesia and made billions of dollars. I mean, became a very wealthy individual. So I think countries can afford it, and multilateral agencies are lending for it. So that was one question. What were the next couple questions? I forgot. Subsidies. So, there was a question about subsidies, right? The short answer to that question is the size and the distribution matter. So subsidies by themselves, not through a Herfindahl. So just looking at the effects of a standalone subsidy or a tax break do matter. So the bigger the subsidy, the bigger the impact. So that's a really great question. And then the last question, I think, was how do you combine policy and academic rigor? Is that it?
Well, more just advice for the, we've got a lot of people here who are young economists, young social scientists, undergrad, grad. They want to, this sounds corny being from Boston University, but they want to be you. And what kind of advice do you want to give them to build a career on rigorous academics, but also to be policy oriented and engage with some of these questions that many folks have wanted to shun?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I really believe in cross-pollination. So I started off as a history major at Berkeley. And I think having a really broad perspective really, really helps kind of make you think more broadly. I also think that people, if they're in the middle of graduate school like I was and not feeling necessarily the relevance, which was my case, they should do what I did. Take a year off, go to the World Bank, go to the Fed, go to a place, take a job at Airbnb, do something like that. Immerse yourself in the real world. I have spent my career going back and forth between academics and actually mostly the World Bank. I started my career at the World Bank. I would encourage people to do more of that. My top academic dean, Catherine Wolfram, actually just left to go work in the Biden administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate. And of course, it killed me to have her leave, but I couldn't be more encouraging because it's such a great, you need a reality check. I think it's a sad thing that so many academics have refrained from being public intellectuals. I just think it's such a loss to the intellectual discourse in the world.
Thanks so much, Anna Harrison. Some great advice for young people to be you and beyond. I hesitate to give you another 4 because they're growing here. What do you think, Dilip? Should we do one more quick round, or should we close?
Very quick. Yeah, maybe just 1 or 2 questions. Why don't you select?
Here's a question from Alicia Kachakova. She's got a PhD in economics, and she lives in the Russian Federation. She says, could you share with us the primary differences in the taxonomy of quantitative aggregates for measuring innovativeness of an industrial enterprise based on functional regularities of technical and technological development in China and India? Perhaps a deep one for the last question. There's a lot of questions here on the governance. And when Dilip was talking about the lecture that Paul Streeten gave at the ADB many years ago about how economists didn't really talk about governance and political economy. There's a lot of questions in the chat here about, well, what about political parties? What about the kind of regime? What about institutions? What are some of the, your talk really talks about the economic rationale, and despite many institutional rigidities, how sometimes it still really works in a robust way, sometimes it doesn't. What are some of those institutional prerequisites that folks should be taking in mind as we're out there trying to design green industrial policy to combat climate change and spark development across the world?
Yeah, that is a great question. So there are guardrails that you can set up, right, before you even start, to ensure that you don't end up subsidizing white elephants. And some of those guardrails involve, for example, saying right from the onset that these will be time-bound policies, that they will not last, that they will be phased out. Another guardrail is, I think, to me, is the most compelling story about Korea, and it relates to our theme today. When South Korea was industrializing, of course, it did have a very strong institutions, but despite those strong institutions, firms were forced and ordered to go global. They had to prove themselves on export markets. Otherwise, the subsidies or support was eliminated. So again, forcing firms to compete. Really, if the wrong sectors are being picked, or if firms are not growing and succeeding, competition will take care of that. So in that sense, kind of closing a company can actually be seen as an indication of success. Companies failing is actually an indication of success. So competition really plays an absolutely critical role. There are other things that can be done. For example, there was a question in the chat about Chile. Chile engaged in a lot of what's called soft industrial policy. They promoted cooperation between public and private sectors. They focused primarily on infrastructure provision, where that infrastructure was provided through guidance from Chamber of Commerce and other associations of business individuals saying, this is what we need to succeed in exporting asparagus, for example, right? So, and it has to be, you have to be willing also to shut things down if they don't work. And that's really important. The Chinese have been very good about that in the past. When something just wasn't working, they just shut it down.
Thanks so much. Well, folks, you can take a quick peek in the chat. You can get links to the different institutes that co-sponsored today, the Institute for Economic Development, the Department of Economics, and the Global Development Policy Center. We want to thank members of the Streeten family who came to join us for this lecture today. We're really honoring the tradition and legacy of Paul Streeten, contributing rigorous new ideas to social science and economics, while also engaging with the policy world to try to make the world a better place. And as Dilip Mukherjee said in his opening remarks today, couldn't think of a better person at this time in this moment than Ann Harrison. I hope all of you take what she said to heart about the rationale for industrial policy, and perhaps the utmost rationale for it now if we're going to solve the climate crisis in the next 10 to 40 years. Thanks so much, Ann Harrison, for joining us. If folks want to go back and look at some of the tables and graphs, this will be on the GDP Center YouTube channel. We'll send everyone a note about it that registered. Thanks so much for coming, everyone.